Hey guys, Dr. Michael Young here. Hope everything is going great in your world. We are pushing ahead. This is lesson 7. Last lesson, lesson 6, we looked at international trade. In this lesson, lesson 7, we're going to look at government intervention in international trade. What are the arguments for intervention in international trade? How do governments intervene in international trade? What are the specific policies and what are the outcomes? So sit back, take notes, and enjoy the lesson. Let's get right started. So let's get started then. Free trade. A lot of countries, including the United States, gives a lot of lip service to free trade, but actually free trade is kind of rare. Most governments intervene. The convention for modern trading system is based on GATT. You might have heard of people talk about GATT, the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade. And this actually was phased out and rolled into the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in the 1990s. China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and since then, most trade in the world occurs through and is regulated by the World Trade Organization. Now, when people want to influence trade, one way they do it is through tariffs. This can be specific tariffs. A tariff is a tax. It's a tax specifically leveled on imports. These can be for specific things, for each unit of an imported good, or it can be an ad valorem, which means a value-added tax, which is levied as a proportion of the value of an imported good. So it can be a blanket thing on a particular country. For example, recently, it's not that recently now, I don't suppose, but President Trump wanted to impose a 45% value-added tax to everything that came from China. The impact, well, it does increase government revenues, but most economists will tell you that it's paid both as the consumers that purchase the good as well as the producer or the country that's producing the good. Tariffs tend to benefit those producers within the country that's imposing the tariff, but they hurt customers. And if you take an economics course on international trade, you can see that there's what's called a dead weight loss. The world is actually worse off. This can be proven mathematically when barriers to trade are imposed. Governments can also impose subsidies. These can be in the form of cash grants, low-interest loans, tax breaks, government equity participation. In fact, you might have heard about a policy that was put before the United Nations, and they wanted to impose an income tax worldwide. One problem with this is that while governments might tax everyone equally, and they want to set it at 15%, which is pretty high, they might be able to do that, but it would be really hard to enforce because governments would then probably turn around and subsidize people in their own policy, either directly or indirectly through giving them tax breaks or giving them direct subsidies. But these subsidies are considered to be unfair trading practices, and they're regulated under the World Trade Organization because if we subsidize our producers, we give them an unfair advantage. Other types of trade policy include import quotas and voluntary export restraints. Import quotas, we might restrict the quantity of some certain type of good that's imported into our country, the United States, for example. Or we might ask other countries to voluntarily restrain their exports. I remember when I was a young guy in the 1980s, whenever Japanese cars first became really popular and it looked like they were going to really wipe out the United States automobile industry, that the U.S. government asked the Japanese government to voluntarily restrain their exports. So these voluntary export restraints are something that's used somewhat, but I can't think of any instances of it being used since that in the 1980s. And it's not really voluntary. Let's face it, nobody really wants to voluntarily restrain their exports. It usually has a little bit of arm twisting behind the scenes. Something that's a lot rarer because most countries want to export as much as they can. That seems to be the strategic goal of trade policy, but occasionally there'll be a tariff placed on an export, or there may be a ban placed on an export. 1975, again, during the oil embargo, the United States put a ban on crude exports. Other instruments of trade, local content requirements. Some governments may say, oh, sure, you can import, say, a car into the United States, but it has to have at least so much of the content produced locally. In fact, I've heard, I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember somebody telling me that Toyota cars sold, Toyota vehicles, they're not just cars, of course, now they're SUVs and trucks and cars, but Toyota vehicles have more locally made content. You look at the value added of a Toyota, it tends to be higher than that of, say, a Ram. Chrysler produces Ram vehicles, and Ram vehicles tend to have a pretty high content value added that's not from the United States. Other ways that countries might make it difficult for countries to import into their country is administrative policies. They can come up with arbitrary rules and hold up goods at the ports and say that, hey, you need to have a certificate of some sort or another, make up stuff. And so China's really good about doing this sort of stuff, holding up imports at its border and saying, for bureaucratic reasons, saying that it's for consumer protection or something else. Something that is allowed under World Trade Organization rules are countries are not allowed to dump. That is, produce and sell something lower than it costs to be made in their market, their own markets. So, for example, if China wants to sell steel in the United States, they're not allowed to dump it. They're not allowed to sell it at what's below a fair market value. Because, countries want to produce certain things that have strategic value and create jobs, even if that means subsidizing them, so they're not allowed to sell them at below fair market value. This is called anti-dumping. Some political arguments for intervention. Well, protect jobs and industries. This is the most common political reason for intervention into trade. Critics say claims of unfair competition are overstated oftentimes for political reasons. Also, protecting national security, certain industries, for example, artificial intelligence or 5G or supercomputing, these things that might have defense uses, that they may not be exported for national reasons of protecting national security. Other reasons for trade intervention might be retaliation. They may use threats of intervention as a bargaining tool to open up foreign markets. They may claim they want to protect consumers. If products are unsafe, then that's a reason that governments may use for banning the import of, say, pet food. I remember using China again as an example. China is a country which I'm most familiar with, a foreign country. There was a period where pet food from China was causing some deaths of some animals, and they said that the pet food it's not safe, it was contaminated, and so they banned it for reasons of protecting consumers, or more accurately, consumers' pets. The United States, being a big trading country, often uses trade intervention for furthering policy objectives, such as punishing rogue states or protecting human rights. There's an infant industry argument for protecting industries that are just getting started. Infants. The idea is that we need to protect this industry because it's just a baby. It hasn't learned to stand on its own 2 feet. If we force it to compete with all these imports that are coming in, it won't survive. Support usually comes through tariffs, import quotas, or subsidies. Critics of that say that protection of manufacturing from foreign competition does no good unless protection helps make the industry efficient. It assumes that firms are unable to make efficient long-term investments by borrowing money from domestic and or international capital markets. Still, there are some economic arguments for intervention, strategic trade policy. You may have heard of something called first mover advantage. The idea is that oftentimes the first firm that moves into an industry might have an advantage over latecomers because they become established. And so, if that's true, then it might pay for a government to intervene to establish a domestic industry, especially one that's strategically important for the future. So a little bit of a history of the world trading system. We talked a little bit about Adam Smith in the last lesson. Adam Smith was father of modern economics, published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. David Ricardo was his contemporary, published his Principles of Political Economy in 1817. Both of these guys advocated free trade. This was a break from the mercantilist tradition that held that free trade was good for the world, it was good for the economy, it was good for workers, it was good for consumers. So this was first embraced. Free trade was first embraced by Great Britain, and there was a period of relatively free trade up until the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. This was during the Great Depression, when the United States imposed a lot of trade barriers to protect their own industries from the effects of the Great Depression, but actually was thought to have made the Great Depression much worse. More recently, from 1947, after World War II, we had the Bretton Woods system, the establishment of GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. There was a great period of trade liberalization and economic growth. This was a booming period from 1947 to 1979. The United States embraced free trade. We tried to get other people to embrace free trade. GATT was designed to liberalize trade by eliminating all those barriers that we just talked about, and it was a pretty success. The GATT is not something that's just one time and it's finished. They go through negotiating phases every now and then. So from 1947 to 1979, they went through 8 rounds, and they were able to keep trading barriers low. World trade flourished. The world economy flourished. Brings us to 1980 and 1993. Things kind of got shaken up quite a bit. Japan, they didn't seem to be playing by the rules. They had neo-mercantilist policies, meaning it seemed as though they were protecting their own industries. And so this caused great big trade deficits with the United States, something that we were not used to. So we began to impose different non-trading barriers. This led to the World Trade Organization. And the Uruguay Round, World Trade Organization, has sought to extend GATT to cover trade and services. It tried to develop rules on intellectual property, reduce agricultural subsidies, strengthen GATT's monitoring and enforcement. The World Trade Organization was established, which encompasses GATT, but it also did another thing. It created a general agreement on trades and services called GATS, an agreement on TRIPS, trade-related aspects of international property rights, also called TRIPS. So this brings us to 2019. By 2019, the latest data that we have available at right in this textbook, we excuse me. Yeah, so by 2019, most of the countries in the world belong to the World Trade Organization. Again, in 2001, China joined, and that was a big boom for China. Accounted for 98% of world trade. It had a strong early start, but since the late 1990s, trade barriers have been unable to be reduced further. And hey, from 2008 to 2009, following the global economic crisis, usually during crises, countries start worrying more about trade. If things are going well, unemployment is low, and GDP is growing, income is growing, people don't worry about trade. But whenever the economy starts to falter, unemployment rates start to rise or whatever, that's usually when people begin to worry about trading. They want to protect their industries, they want to shift the blame, and so a couple of things that have happened recently. You might have heard of Brexit, the British exit from the economic union. And also, we know that the election of Donald Trump with Make America Great Again, imposition of trade barriers, these things signal a move towards greater protectionism. So, right now, to be honest, World Trade Organization is kind of in a state of crisis. A lot of it has to do with trade spats that are occurring between the United States and China, or China and a lot of other countries. China does not seem to be playing by the same rule book that a lot of the other members of the World Trade Organization play by. And it's difficult because a lot of Chinese companies are state-owned companies. So when you're talking about, say, subsidizing state-owned companies, it's really hard to make a distinction for a state-owned company. Because in a way, all of state-owned companies, since they're government-owned, are receiving government payments. So it's not like a private company or a private corporation in the United States where there's a very clear distinction between the corporation and the government. So whenever there's a transfer of payments, it's very clear. It makes it harder. Yeah, they're trying to expand WTO to cover things like global communication and financial services as well as FDI, but there's still lots of unresolved issues. For example, those TRIPS that we talked about, they keep coming up. Intellectual property is something that's very important to a developed economy like the United States. And right now, the TRIPS agreement obliges those WTO members to grant and enforce patent lasting at least 20 years and copyrights lasting at least 50 years. If those are not enforced, then the argument is that this will reduce incentives for innovation. What's happened as well is there have been lots of multilateral or bilateral trade agreements. Bilateral means two countries. Multilateral means more than two countries, several countries, multiple countries. And, for example, you've heard of NAFTA, right? You might have heard of ASEAN. There are all of these different organizations that are created because Doha round of the WTO is not working. It's not working, and so countries are taking matters into their own hand, establishing agreements between one or other countries, and not going through the WTO or bypassing the WTO. World Trade Organization, the World Trade System is under threat. There are two events that really show that. The British withdrawal from the European Union, as well as the election of Donald Trump. Donald Trump made no secret that he did not believe in free trade. He wanted the United States to take a more unilateral stand in trade agreements. And so he made that quite clear and pushed that. This upset a lot of people, a lot of our trading partners, including Australia and Europe, not to mention China. Another thing that's happening right now is, well, as I'm making this recording, the Russian Federation, or Russia, has attacked Ukraine. And this is going to cause things to happen in ways that we can't really predict. So it's no secret, I believe, and it's not an exaggeration to say that the world economic system is under strain right now. This includes the monetary system, the trade system, the global world order that's been in place since World War II is not going to be here much longer. It's going to change. What that's going to look like, who knows? Why should you care about trade and trade policy? Well, as future managers, this is going to affect your ability to export. If trade policies are put in place or removed in your industry in the home country, in the United States, if you're working from the United States, that's going to affect your ability to compete. If we put up barriers to your industry in the United States, it may increase your ability to make profits. So things that you might have to worry about are quotas, serve a country from locations outside the country, local content requirements might come into place. You may want to locate production activities in another country or reduce the threat of future trade barriers. One example that I'm familiar with is the case of Apple. President Trump and President Biden, lots of administrations going back for a long time, have made noises about actually assembling and manufacturing iPhones and Apple products in the United States. Apple, of course, is resistant to this type of pressure because that will hurt their competitive advantage. To have to manufacture those things in high cost, low efficient locations will put those companies at a disadvantage. So it affects managers' jobs. Policy implications. There are drawbacks to government intervention. Might retaliate and trigger a trade war. Unlikely to be well executed with the opportunity for it to be captured by special interest groups. And, all of these things will affect your career as a manager in the future. Hey guys, it's me again. That's all we're going to do for today. I hope you enjoyed this lesson. Stay awesome. I'll see you next time.